Thank you so much for sharing the time with us this afternoon. And I know all of us, our minds are engaged with this very important issue concerning social justice versus social injustices and all forms of social discrimination, cultural misunderstanding, no fairness in some practices, and it's time to just take a moment and think about these issues, and because every small change starts within self, and I see all participants all of us are capable to do that job in terms of taking the moment, looking inside ourselves, and then project for the all the external environment in terms of inducing change, small change or changes. So thank you so much for that. And there are some probably protocol that I would like to share with you, that the recording will be shared after we complete the work. And this session, teaching race, is really co-sponsored by our great African-American studies program, coordinated by my colleague, Dr. Emily Field. Thank you, Emily, for that. And she will be leading one of the breakout session. And also this session or this event is co-sponsored by our institutional diversity office. And the office is led by our colleague, Dr. Louis Peretz, is the director, and also he will be leading one of the coordinator of the breakout rooms. And so thank you for your sponsorship, and thank you for your time, Louis. And also, there are really people behind the scene. They help us, starting with the Minnock Institute for Global Engagement, Susan Williams, and also Sasha Link, and she's with us. She's gonna write about this because she is a writer, and also she is a photographer, and she is a doctoral student. And also I thank my colleague, Dr. Kevin McCowan. I know he has a problem, power, he lost power this morning, so probably he will join us. If he does, he will also lead one of the breaking out session or rooms. Thank you, Kevin, for that. And Kevin is, one of his really job is to, is a faculty associate with Martin Richard Institute for Social Justice. So he's not just a professor of early education, but he's doing this very hard, tight job, but he's doing a wonderful job in that sense. And also, I would like to thank Dr. Jenna Shanahan. She is the assistant provost for her support, and she will give some opening remarks. And also thanking my friend, Dr. Nkai To. He will be sharing his closing remarks with us before the end of this event. Thank you for his support. And definitely, as probably some of you heard the introduction between Dr. Mary Grant and our speaker. So thank you, Mary, for your help and your support for that. And I know you have a very hard task because you are a senior administrative fellow for civics and social justice. So you just fit into this whole conversation. And for our IT supporters, I have Mark Johnson, I have Nick Burns, and I have some of our students, Kim Isaac. I'm sorry if I forgot other names. I appreciate that. And I know this event was supported by the Jewish Muslim Coalition. You know, this is a wonderful organization. It's a young organization, but they work together. And this is what, when you think about the impulse of the United States, you take these small things. So you see Muslim and Jewish, they work, and students. And you know, that's really a great experimental, especially in with BSU campus. With this, I would like to invite Dr. Jenny Shanahan, the Assistant Provost, to give her short opening remarks.
Thank you, Jabbar. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to see you all here. Welcome to colleagues, to our students, and to our guests, including our speaker and our special guest today, Dr. Pamela Barnett. Thank you so much for being with us. During a pandemic that has disproportionately ravaged Black and Brown communities, and in the context of decades of relentless racist violence, you all know that the killing of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Jacob Blake have caused unbearable sorrow and anger. 1 week after George Floyd's death, when protests were raging across the country and the world and in our local region, when the pain was especially raw, we had a racist incident that shook our own campus community. During that same week, an urgent and intentional response began here at BSU. A letter of demands from a group of concerned Black graduates of the class of 2020, calling for changes to the curriculum, co-curriculum, residence life, and campus policing, among other issues, was signed by over 2,000 people. 2 campus forums on racial justice drew hundreds of participants and elicited examples of racist experiences of Black and Brown students, alumni, and employees. Another powerful event emerged from that. It was called Amplify, the Voices of Black and Brown BSU Students. That was held on August 4th. And whether you were able to attend or not, I highly recommend the thorough report of that event that may be available on the BSU intranet soon. In the meantime, I would be happy to send it to anyone. And I know Dr. Emily Field, who led that program with students, would be happy to send it to you. Now, a presidential task force on racial justice has begun its work with the explicit intention to be a force for change. As university trustee and one of the chairs of the task force, David Alexander, has reminded us, it's a task force. Faculty, librarians, and staff from myriad programs are also organizing anti-racist teaching and learning workshops, such as the one we're going to hear from today. And the next one is next Wednesday at 3 p.m. They are also seeking to decolonize the curriculum and working to dismantle systemic racism and the legacy of colonialism here at BSU. As all of those efforts make clear, addressing persistent inequities in education and in our broader society must include examining and changing our own practices and our own institution. Moving beyond the goals of access and compositional diversity to equity and inclusion requires support and community. I am grateful for the great turnout here. I just keep seeing the numbers increasing. We got 4 pages of people participating. You're committed to change, and it's exciting and inspiring for all of us, I know, to be part of that community. And I'm grateful for the support of leaders like Dr. Barnett, who's helping us take on this critically important foundational work. Thank you, Dr. Barnett. Thank you for this opportunity to address you all. I look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Janahan. So it's now time to introduce our speaker, Dr. Pamela. Barnett's research in higher education have focused on advancing diverse students' bodies and curricula. She served most recently as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and Distinguished Professor of English at Trinity Washington University in Washington, D.C., one of the few remaining women's colleges. Trinity enrolls a student body that is majority Pell grant eligible, first generation to college and underrepresented minority. Currently, she actually serves as the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Salle University in Philadelphia. Very honored and very pleased that Dean Barnett is with us this afternoon. So thank you so much and welcome to Bridgewater State University, and all of us are very actually excited to hear your presentation, and the floor is yours and you can share your PowerPoint now.
Okay, I'll share my screen in just a moment, but thank you for the invitation. Right before, maybe an hour ago, I ran into, I think, the one other person who's on campus today who actually is on this call. Thank you, Jason Diaz, Professor Jason Diaz, for being here. He's a professor of integrated science, business, and technology here at LaSalle. But we're talking in the hallway, and I told him I was doing this talk, and we're talking about this moment. And I said, you know, maybe something really is changing, something is different. And I will tell you that the article or the book chapter that I wrote, and it's in this book, Teaching Race, How to Help Students Unmask and Challenge Racism. It's Stephen Brookfield edited the collection. I have a book chapter in it. And you know, this came out more than a year ago, but my invitations to speak about this have all come in the last, 6 months. So a little more than that. So I just feel like that there's something happening, and that there's movement, and there's openness and activism that is going to push us to be better. And I'm so excited about that. I have to be positive about some things. Actually, we are, of course, in a pandemic, and last night's debate was unbelievable. So as I thought about how to start, I was like, well, where do I even begin as I want to say people's names, right? And I decided on Trayvon Martin, that I would start with Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Clemente Pinckney, Freddie Gray, Ahmaud Arbery more recently, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. And I could have started so much farther back in history, and there's so many names that I didn't even name, but it's just this overwhelming list of Black men and women who have been killed by police, by white supremacists, victims of anti-Blackness, victims of white supremacy. And we're having a national reckoning. Black Lives Matter has really pulled us, really since Michael Brown, but very recently, it's really pulled us into the streets, even in a pandemic, to have people putting on their masks and going into the streets all over this country to say, this has to stop, that our country is, we have an aspiration to a diverse, inclusive democracy that's not being delivered on, that there's violence and inequity, and that something has to change. And I look at this moment and the people in the streets, and I'm thinking, my gosh, a university is like a wonderful place to be right now if we want to be part of the solution, right? That our role is so critical. We are preparing citizens and leaders and human beings who hopefully are concerned about serving something larger than themselves, getting their education and doing something, doing well, but doing good in the world. I look to that generation to deliver on some of the promises of democracy. And I think we have to do our part, and I think we can. And it really is, it's a very uniquely diverse context, right? That most people are living in segregated neighborhoods. They're going to segregated K through 12 schools, whether public or private. There are not that many places where people come together in the ways that you do in a university, where diverse student bodies. And Jabbar mentioned the student body at Trinity, but one reason I'm at LaSalle is we are a uniquely diverse student body for the Philadelphia region. We're about 45% Pell Grant eligible. A little over 40% of our students are of color. This is a truly economically, ethnically, racially diverse campus. And the diversity we have in our classrooms at LaSalle, at Bridgewater State University, this is the ideal environment for the kind of learning that we want, that we can advocate for and promote if we want a better world. So one thing that this talk will not be, as we think about a better world, is about, what do you say or not say, right? What do you do or not do, right? I am very influenced, and you'll hear it through this talk, by my teacher. His name's Dr. Charles Rajman. He is a French psychoanalyst and works in the field of conflict resolution and helping people who are divided by very painful histories to work together to solve the common problems in their communities. So every year, I follow him on Facebook and we're friends. Every year he's in Rwanda working with Hutus and Tutsis, assassins and survivors who have to live in the same villages and cities and work together to solve common problems after genocide. And how do you do that work? And I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of some of how you do that work. But he works with Palestinians and Israelis and French police and immigrant youth, very active in Colombia recently, and very interested in the US context, and has, comes to the US, hopefully at least once or twice a year, because he's very concerned about our democracy, and particularly the racial division and injustice that marks North American life. So one of the things, though, that I bring from Rajman is this idea that people need to learn how to live together and work together. And that the way you do that is not by sort of stipulating how people do that work. You build enough trust and humanity between people who are antagonists so that they can speak honestly together, have conflict, which can be deeply productive, right? Really hear each other's pain and truth and arguments. And then you get the collective intelligence of the group that enables you to solve problems. So that's something that I bring to my work in the classroom. And frankly, my work as a leader. I think that some of the things I talk about today are things that I think can be important really in any diverse context where you want the intelligence of the group to try to solve problems. And the problem before us is how do we create an anti-racist culture? So I'm going to begin with a little bit of an assumption that I feel pretty safe making given my years before. I'm a dean now. I started my career as a professor of English and African American Studies at the University of South Carolina, and I'll share at least one story about that experience. I also spent many years in faculty development. I left my faculty position and I moved I was an associate vice provost for teaching and learning at Temple, and faculty development was in that portfolio. And one thing I know from leading conversations about teaching race and teaching there's a general education requirement, diversity requirement at Temple. But I know that a lot of times people will avoid allowing real conversation on this because it's scary. I know from many of my colleagues that they would lecture, to make sure, I want everyone to understand white privilege, so I'm going to walk them through the concept of white privilege. I want people to understand the concept of structural racism, so I'm going to work them through that. And sometimes suppressing voice in the class because of the messiness and the potential for conflict. Or when it happens, feeling responsible for shutting it down quickly, right? And sort of struggling with, if I allow, even, questionable or offensive comments, am I contributing to a harassing environment? And I'm going to argue, and I hope it will be helpful, that there's a difference between conflict and violence, and that we want to invite that conflict if we really want people to learn. So my screen is shared, correct? Yes. So why is this not advancing? There we go, roadmap. So I'm going to share some goals, learning goals that I have for teaching about race. They apply in almost any class I teach. This is a very practical talk. I want you to leave with things that you can do. So some 4 specific strategies for building trust that sort of scaffold from easier to harder. And then some strategies for managing and learning from conflict. And I, as I already told you, a sort of a preview, that I think it's very important and helpful to distinguish conflict from violence. So some of the learning goals that I bring to this talk are cognitive. I want students to recognize and apply this concept of structural racism to analyses of social inequality and to lived experience, right? Jane Smiley wrote an article in the New Yorker many years ago, but she says, one of the problems with anti-racist work is people think that it's about, or white people think it's about whether or not they like Black people or not, that they think it's very individual and that they really need to understand the structural nature of racism. I also have very democratic and what I would call effective goals, that through the learning that happens in a classroom that teaches about race, that students will better understand themselves and others and their relationship to others within these pervasive systems of structural inequality. And I hope that they'll develop empathy for experiences and perspectives different than their own. And building trust is essential to that. So I want to tell you a story that I found incredibly moving. It was in the Washington Post in 2016, I think. I'm sure some of you saw this. So Derek Black, he was a college student at New College in Florida. And he was also a pretty prominent white nationalist. His father hosted a weekly radio program, white nationalist radio program. Among his, beliefs were that really every race should have its own racially homogenous homeland, right? That conflict was inevitable. Other kinds of beliefs about white supremacy, that white culture was that that anything good that had ever been created, it really started with whites. And he had these beliefs and he didn't really share them, even though he was an out advocate for these ideas. I think he knew that he wasn't going to be accepted in that college environment. And at some point it became known, someone at New College realized that he was a white nationalist leader and radio personality. And this enraged Facebook thread on the campus started, that he needs to be expelled, that he needs to be shunned, we have this, within this evil within our midst. And somebody on the thread said, is there anyone on this thread who's smart enough to figure out a way to change this guy's mind? So by the time that all of this is happening, his name is Derek Black. He moves out of the residence hall, right? Feeling ostracized, gets an off-campus apartment. But before he left, he, had some friendly relationships with students on his hall. And one was a Jewish man who hosted a weekly Shabbat dinner. And he decided he was going to invite Derek Black, and Derek accepted the invitation. And apparently for the first few Shabbat dinners, they didn't talk about this elephant in the room, but eventually they started to engage it. And Derek talked about his beliefs and he heard other people's beliefs. He starts to be deeply influenced, not just by what he's learning in school, right? He's reading about white privilege. He's learning about the contributions of non-Western culture. He's learning about how African Americans are disproportionately incarcerated, right? So he's scholarly. He's learning things from the research and from the scholarship, but he's also having this experience with other students from diverse backgrounds who start to challenge him. And Derek Black has, I'd say, a bit of a conversion experience. He ended up changing his views significantly, and he sent a letter to the Southern Poverty Law Center disavowing white nationalism, and he invited the organization to publish his letter. And the letter said this: "The things I have said, as well as my actions, have been harmful to people of color, people of Jewish descent, activists striving for opportunity and fairness for all. I'm sorry for the damage done. And then he addressed this question that he's really, I'm going to say, uniquely equipped to answer. You know, how can you change racist or racially biased hearts and minds? And he said, any change is going to require, and it's quote, person-to-person interactions, and quote, a lot of honest listening on both sides. And he credited his newly democratic and anti-racist commitments to the diverse people who he said included him in conversations rather than ostracizing him. So that is the kind of thing that can happen in college. We can structure, not everyone gets invited to Shabbat dinner. What can we do in the classrooms when we have all of these students together learning? We can create structures where people start to have that kind of learning from each other. So this is strategy number one, and it's what Charles Rajman calls the good doctor. You're going to be asking students to be vulnerable, to talk about things that they may not ever talk about and that they certainly don't talk about in diverse and interracial groups, right? Frankly, I think I've had to work really hard in my own life to get into interracial groups where I can have these conversations. Like, we live in a very segregated world. And so you're going to be asking them to do something powerful, and they need reassurance that you are going to be a good guide, a good doctor for the room. So, and Charles, of course, is a psychoanalyst, and he does a lot of group work on what he calls transformational social therapy. So he needs to come into a group and say, I got this. I know what I'm doing. These are my commitments. You know, to inspire some confidence and a little bit of a sense of safety and trust in the leader. And we need to do that as instructors. As soon as and right in the beginning, we have to introduce ourselves in meaningful ways. So I want to give the example of when I started at the University of South Carolina. I'm the only white professor of African American Studies at that time there. Long story about how I got that job, but I was not prepared for it. I hadn't actually applied for the job. I applied for a different one. I got this one, and I get thrown into something that truly changes my life. But I start this work. I'm going into classrooms that are mostly Black students, in fact, almost all Black students, and then me as the white teacher. And I'm given a mentor in my first year, and she's like, you're going to be fine. You have a lot of expertise. Make sure that the students, you know, are aware of your expertise. Okay, so I'm going to line on my expertise, and then I'm like, well, I have some ideas about how to be a good teacher and to be accessible and fair, and you know, I think my natural warmth will come through, and hopefully they'll trust me. And you know, just really, I'm not ready for this, and I'm avoiding it. Right? That I'm the white teacher in this classroom. Like, it needs to be addressed. Like, why in the world should they trust me? And especially if I don't have the guts to like speak about this very obvious thing in the room. So I got a gift, a student, and really this is, I think, my second semester at University of South Carolina. I got this gift early on, which I think became a gift to my students. But a student turned in a paper, and he submitted a poem that he wrote on an index card that he stapled to the front of the paper. And this was the poem he wrote to me. And this is before I went silver. It is the first day of Afro 398, and who do I see but a short, black-haired, white lady looking at me. Why is she here? What's her story? I didn't think whites cared about our history. The answer to these questions I do not know. So I will sit back, watch, and go with the flow. So he's given me an opportunity, and I have probably read that poem at the beginning of every class I've taught since, right? And part of what I need to do is I'm modeling my vulnerability, that I was afraid to talk about it, like many of them are, right? And that a student challenged me, and that now I need to talk about it. And I tell them a little bit about my commitments, right? That I feel that whites are as responsible for dealing with racism as people of color, just as men are as responsible for, you know, addressing sexism as women are, right? That we have to be in this together. So I am responsible for this. I am supposed to be in this space. We are all supposed to be in this space. But that there's things I know and there are things I don't know. And that as a teacher, I believe in the co-construction of knowledge, that I'm going to bring what I'm responsible as the teacher, and I have some authority in the classroom, but certainly responsibility for kind of sharing what I know, but also overarching responsibility for facilitating their contributions so that we learn from the diversity in the group, the collective intelligence in the group. And amazing things can happen in a room like that where you have real diversity. So I have my way of kind of starting. I was wondering if, and maybe we'll just have one or two, but if there are other people on this call who have, maybe you didn't call it the good doctor, but you have a little bit of an introductory narrative that you tell students to tell them why you're there. And for me, I try to instill trust by telling them that I've been working in this area for a long time and I have some specific strategies for doing what we're going to do, and trying to give them some confidence that things are going to be managed, that I'm ready for what's coming. Wondering if one or two people though would share the way they introduce themselves to a class, to position themselves in terms of their social identity, and also reassure the students that they're in good hands. And maybe if you could raise your hand, Jabbar said he would kind of look for any contributors and we would give the floor to one or two people.
Don't see any hands. So.
Well, I'd love you to think about this, right? I think it's very important for students to know that you're aware of your social identity in the classroom, how it might affect different kinds of students in the classroom. And again, a little bit of reassurance that, that you're inviting them to a deep kind of learning, and that you are very intentional about your methods and your goals. So second, I think this one's pretty easy, but a very humanizing icebreaker, right? The students need to start to get to know each other as human beings. It's one thing to build trust between you and the students, and another to build trust among the students. And we know, I'll talk about this more, but that trust builds kind of in relation to kind of risk-taking, an expression of vulnerability and humanity. So my favorite icebreaker, you might want to steal it. It's from, so I'm an English professor, but anyone can use it. So Sandra Cisneros, novelist Sandra Cisneros, has written a book called The House on Mango Street, and there's a chapter called My Name. It's one page. I share it with the students. My name models a reflection on names that entails family history, ethnicity, and even fantasies of self-definition. So the narrator's name is Esperanza, and she writes, in English, my name means hope. In Spanish, it means too many letters. It means sadness. It means waiting. It was my great-grandmother's name, and now it is mine. She remarks that at school, people say her name funny, as if the syllables were made out of tin and hurt the roof of your mouth. But she also says that her name is made of a softer something when it's voiced in Spanish. Still, she says, I would like to baptize myself under a new name, a name more like the real me. So I give students this little one-page vignette. It's quick, they can read it, and ask them to use it as a model to do a little bit of a reflection on their name. And students get to say as much or as little as they want, but it's an exercise that I find does bring out family stories very often, stories that are about ethnic or religious identity, naming ceremonies or practices sometimes come up. Like this one, people talk about how others experience their name, right? And very often it has something to do with social identity. So that's my icebreaker. You can figure out others, but really anything that gets them starting to know each other. And when I've got a class where I really need to build trust because I want the students to go deep, I'll do an icebreaker, once a week, right? Things that get them to know each other, to get them to know each other as human beings, maybe to recognize a little commonality so that when the conflict comes, they already have a little bit of a relationship. And they're a little more prepared to weather it. So I think it's an important strategy. So we know that trust builds in relation to the graduated escalation of risk. I reveal a little something, you're going to reveal a little something more, and it's the risk of usually of vulnerability. It also builds with successful collaborative experience and repeated interactions with an immediate circle of collaborators. So Marshall and Stoll are actually writing about civic engagement in neighborhoods, but it applies to the classroom. You have students working together in the lab. You have students working together on a project, a presentation. You have students working together in small groups in class to discuss an intriguing or beautiful or meaningful disciplinary question. So this principle leads to the next strategy. The first two, I think, are pretty easy. The third one's a little harder, and it's articulating hopes and fears. And there are a few ways of doing this, but these are the prompts that I give people. How do you hope that we will interact and discuss with each other right in this class, which teaches about race? And what do you hope will learn or gain? So I want their hopes. But the real key is the second question, which is what fears or discomforts do you have about discussing race with the people in this class? Not generally. I want people to really think about what scares me in this room. And frankly, sometimes I even ask, like, who are you afraid of in the room? But that's really a high risk. No one has to answer this publicly. They can. And sometimes I've worked in classes where they eventually answer it publicly. But I want everyone to write down their answers to these questions and to really think about what it is that they're afraid of. And I know that we're getting somewhere where people say really honest things, right? When someone says, I'm afraid I'm gonna say something that people are gonna think is racist. I'm afraid I'm gonna reveal bias. I'm afraid that if I get emotional, everyone's gonna say, there's the angry Black woman. I'm afraid that if I speak with some emotion, people are gonna say I'm oversensitive or not listen to me. I'm afraid that I'm gonna say something and a person with more privilege is gonna say it and they're the ones who are gonna get credit for it. Like once people start to talk about the real things that happen in these spaces and the things that do keep us from talking honestly. A couple of ways of doing this. I have done it with Post-its. Everybody writes down like a hope or a fear on a Post-it. I take them all up and put them all around the room. It's like a gallery walk. And one of the things that happens is people start to see that there's some commonality to the fears. Like, oh, that fear that I might say the wrong thing, or that fear that people are going to think I'm biased or even racist. Oh, I'm not the only one who has that fear in this room. I have this fear that things are going to get out of control, right? That I'm not the only person who has this fear in the room. And there is something about that that is incredibly neutralizing. I have done this so many times that I just find it's a very powerful, exercise. It really frees people a bit, that they're nursing this thing that makes them feel like there's something maybe bad about me and my interaction, and not kind of recognizing how overdetermined a lot of these concerns are. So I ask people to share their hopes and fears, and I'm going to ask you to do that right now in the chat function. You are welcome.
You have Wendy Williams, please. Go ahead and give your comments, and then Emily Field. We have probably less than 10 minutes, and we'll go to the breaking room sessions. But these two request. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jabbar. My apologies. It was from the initial slide around the good doctor, like what we do in starting our classrooms. So I hate to go back, but just briefly want to say that, so I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Work here at Bridgewater. And one of the courses that I teach is Dynamics of Diversity and Oppression in our Master of Social Work program. And so even to your exercise, where and how do we position ourselves you know, as we begin to create the learning space and community, you know, I think your example and even the activity of the name game, it really does, it helps to disarm for students when we as faculty show our transparency, our authenticity, our willingness to take risks, because we're modeling for them, you know, what the experience is. And I think there's definitely great appreciation when we demonstrate it, but we also maintain it, particularly when we get into the space of when it gets harder. You know, it's one thing to say what you're afraid to talk about, and then to actually say what you're afraid to say. And so I think, again, what you establish and create as an atmosphere is also so critical to maintaining throughout the learning process.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry that I didn't have my video on.
That's all right.
Emily, Dr. Emily Field.
Oh, I was also just volunteering for the last prompt, so we can move on. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
So Jabbar, you're saying I have 10 minutes, so I'm gonna move a little bit more quickly. Do look at the chat. There are some ideas about using Google Docs for allowing anonymous comments. I've used things like Poll Everywhere or other kind of interactive software for the anonymous comments. But again, there really is something very powerful about people naming some of these things. I'm afraid I'm going to offend someone. So this leads to strategy 4. And that's ground rules that address these hopes and fears. So if we do this right, we'll get a list of some of the hopes and the fears, right? Maybe on the board, maybe on a screen. And then we can establish ground rules that would help us address those. And you know, some people do that anyway, right? Like, how are we going to have a good conversation? Well, we're going to listen to each other. We're going to give different people airtime. We're going to, right? But in this kind of classroom, we do it in a very intentional way. So I have a hope that we're going to be listening to each other and feeling heard by each other. The ground rule is, okay, we're going to listen attentively, but we're going to help people feel heard by reflecting back what we hear said, and particularly if it's something that's kind of contentious or you know, difficult, right? Like, this is what I heard you say. Let's say that people say, I have a fear that I'm going to be misunderstood. Well, we're going to give and take opportunities to clarify or amend comments. This activity goes really well. You get the hopes and fears, you help people sort of imagine what the ground rules are. Those get typed up, they get shared with the community, and then the class as a community gets to kind of try to hold each other to it, right? But there's been some real groundwork. Now listen, I know this is a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of time, but I insist that if we don't do this work, we are missing incredible opportunities in our classes. We don't want students to only read the literature. We don't want students maybe to go home and nurse their private, you know, biases or concerns, or not ask the questions that they might ask and that they might learn from because they're scared in the space. So I am a believer that this is a very unique context. And if we don't do this kind of work, we're not going to get, frankly, I'm going to say the conflict that is important for learning. So I'm going to end with a couple of strategies for managing the conflict. And one is by really working with students and helping them understand the concept of structural racism. It's foundational knowledge. It's one of my learning goals that they'll understand it and be able to apply it. I like to apply it to what happens in the classroom, to sometimes depersonalize the conflict-inducing comments that emerge, right? It doesn't mean people aren't responsible for the things that they say that might be offensive or hurtful. It doesn't mean people aren't responsible for the ways they dismiss each other or lay on the guilt, right? There are these different kinds of violences we do to each other, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But that we want people to recognize how overdetermined a lot of what happens is. So I give them readings about structural racism. This is a definition of structural racism that I often share. I'll give you a moment to look at that. I think it's very important to, you know, move away from that individual, you know, that it's all about individuals, and help people see like how embedded racism is in the social, economic, political, and I'm going to say representational systems that we live in. So it's not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. It's a
Sorry to interrupt you. We lost your slide.
Oh, wow. Where, hold on just a moment. Share screen. Is it back?
Yes.
Okay, let me go back on the slideshow.
Yep.
Thank you.
So this definition, kind of what we do is we create a list of sample questions. And again, that's if you want the full list, it's in this book. And there are really good essays in this book. So I highly recommend it. I'm just proud to be in the company of those colleagues. But we have this list of questions that really ask us to think about the structural nature of some of the beliefs and ideas and knowledge that people bring to the classroom. So students have, like they have the ground rules that they hold each other to, they can have these sample questions. Is this comment based on facts or personal and cultural convictions? And both are okay, but how do you know? And where did this idea come from? And what systems or factors reinforce or challenge this knowledge or belief? And what cultural systems reinforce or challenge this belief? And I think this is a critical question. So what evidence should we consult if we want to confirm or question this knowledge or belief? So to get people starting to think about like where these ideas come from, that it's not just unique to the individual. There are very few things that get said in a class that don't, that are unique to the individual. So kind of helping people understand where it's coming from and maybe start to challenge where it's coming from. And this quote is from colleagues who have studied the intergroup dialogue method at University of Michigan, right? They've been doing this for a long time. They're very good at it. And they have found that with questions like these, that students, they start to understand that what's surfacing among the social identity groups is really the result of historical and institutional dynamics of privilege and oppression, right? So we're teaching this concept of structural racism and inequality through the dynamics that are happening in the class, and by asking them to reflect on those dynamics with the kinds of questions that I just posed. So this is my last real point. One of the ways that we manage conflict is by helping students have a framework for distinguishing it from violence. So Charles Rajman, he really insists we need the conflict, right? That people need to say, that offends me, that hurts, this is how this affects me, this is how what you're saying makes me feel like I can't speak or contribute, right? That people need to have the conflict, and sometimes it's profoundly uncomfortable. But how do we make sure that we're not wounding people? And he gives us this framework, and he calls them the 4 violences that we do and the 4 violences that we fear. He also says that the violence we fear most is the one we are most likely to do to others. So that's deep and worth thinking about. But one is physical or verbal attack. Another is to shame or humiliate others. A third is to kind of lay on the guilt or kind of lay the blame, at someone's feet. And the fourth that people often don't think about as much is what he calls abandonment, that dismissal of, I don't want to hear what you have to say. Nothing you have to say is meaningful to me. And they're all forms of dehumanization. And this dehumanization, right, it's on a continuum of not fully seeing people all the way through to genocide, right? And one of the things that I found very powerful when I read about the killing of Michael Brown and the testimony, and I forgot the name of that officer. I think it was Darren Wilson. I could be wrong about that. But his testimony, he said he was scared. And he said, that was the pronoun he used. He said, it was like a demon coming at him. And I just thought that dehumanization that you hear in that rhetoric, right, allowed that murder. And if we can teach people not to dehumanize each other, but to listen to each other, to connect to each other, even to fight each other, right? that's it. Rather than abandon each other and just say there's no point in it, they'll never understand. The fighting or the conflict is actually, Charles Rajman would say, a kind of love, right? That you're engaging with the person, you're choosing to engage with their humanity. Now, this is still messy, right? I've just given you 4 definitions of violence, and then something happens in the classroom, like, oh, is it conflict or violence? And sometimes it's not so easy to tell, right? I'm willing as the instructor to be the one to say, you know, that's conflict or violence, but I usually will turn it to the class first. Is this conflict or violence? And they get used to asking the question, is this conflict or violence? And we do our best to try to stay in a productive space of conflict where someone can say, I want to build the wall to keep immigrants out of the US. And someone could say, I'm an immigrant and, you know, this is my story, and to have it out, that's conflict, right? And that's productive. And it's so much better that those 2 students have that conversation than for them to get a lecture and then go back to their residence hall and just kind of stay with the belief that they always had and not bring it to the light of day and not get challenged, not hear someone else's story. So I think it's an important kind of framework. The last thing I'm going to say, and boy, those minutes flew, Jabbar. I wish I'd love to come back one day because there's so much to talk about, but it's less demanding to, like, let's say, preach to the choir, right? It's so much easier, like, if we kind of get up and lecture and we assume that everyone in the classroom has anti-racist commitments, that they sort of start where we do. It's very tempting to install a false harmony. I think it's tempting to sometimes just quickly shut things down when they're getting a little uncomfortable. But when I said that we need to step up and do our part for those young people who are in the streets, it's this kind of work to create the space where they can bring some of their diverse perspectives to the light of day, where they can maybe get uncomfortable with each other, where they can sort of test ideas and maybe gain empathy for each other's positions, and ultimately work together to create what I would call the beloved community. So
Right.
You're all doing the good work, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Barnett. So now, Mark, our friend, won't you just go to the, let's do 5 rooms.
I'll say something that was very, that I thought was very important to me, is the revelation that almost we have to do, right, with our students, kind of revealing our positionalities and those social identities that either gives us privilege or limits our abilities to exist, or even provide other possibilities for students, right? Because part of the process is also teaching them about their socializations and how that impacts their understanding or lack of understanding. So I appreciate her mentioning of this almost like self-awareness of, this is who I am, this is the privilege or lack of privilege that I carry, and this is my intention, and this is how I'm trying to build trust with you. I thought that was key.
Well said. I agree, Luis.
And it's often easier said than done, right? Because when you're put in the spot, it's like, what part of me do I reveal, or how much do I share, right? Because sometimes it's like, am I overcompensating? Am I saying too much? Right? I mean, I go through those questions sometimes when I'm teaching the course that Wendy mentioned, the dynamics of diversity and oppression, because there's so many examples that I can take from that it sometimes becomes overwhelming.
I think too that I think, you know, the diversity of the students in the classroom, at least at face value, which again, race is what we see first. Right. You know, I think that also influences, again, how we position ourselves. So she, you know, talked about her experiences being a white faculty in a classroom of almost all Black students. And so, when we think about, what our experiences are for myself, as a Black woman in classroom spaces that are predominantly white, well, what do I say? How do I say it? Should I be saying that? Am I saying it too soon? Like all of the points you just made, Luis, versus when our classes now are more diverse, be it in terms of race, in terms of gender, again, those beginning assumptions that we make about someone's identities until we develop that trust, that rapport, that place of relating where now, okay, I'm learning more about you, you're learning more about me. So I think that's important too.
I think what's really mentioned about how to connect with the student in the class, it's a very difficult moment for us as faculty, and because you are walking into the unknown when you have the first class. But this is, where we have to take the responsibility and initiate that. So if there is any sense of fear, I think that fear starts within ourselves, and I can tell you, as and I said that yesterday, a person that comes from different cultures, I have this difficulty sometimes to connect with my students because they probably misinterpret what I'm going to say. So we need to do to build bridges, and I love the word trust. I mean, this is really important.
It's hard work that is foundational to what we do. Like I just feel that all of the other efforts that I and my colleagues make in teaching and learning are ineffectual and cannot be successful if we're not first dismantling racism and at least attacking some of those systems that are creating inequities from the beginning. When students enter our classes or our spaces or their relationships with us and each other.
I see students, they are willing to share a lot of stories when you travel with them, like in study abroad or exchange programs, because that sense of privacy kind of it's a reduction process, and then they will open up to other groups. Remember, because you're eating, drinking, dancing, going here. So there is the environment is very cohesive and then inclusive. I mean, you take it as a model for our classes in the first day or the second day. But remember, I mean, I'm guilty of this. Well, we don't have time to speak more about this, because we have syllabus to follow and things like that. So I think that we need to shift this mentality a little bit, because anything of the topics that we've been hearing about, over the summer and now is very important, and we should seize that teachable moment.
Jabbar, I thought that point you just made was so important, that that any of us can get so attached to our content or our learning goals or whatever for the course that we can lose sight of that context and just have like put on blinders or something to try to accomplish something that that we would accomplish a lot better if we first created an inclusive and equitable environment.
Warm up a little bit, and let's start with Dr. Kevin Guan. If you're gonna give us some of the feedback that you got, you have 3 minutes. And unmute yourself, please.
Yes, well, we talked about trying to do this kind of work in a virtual environment. So we were thinking we are pretty comfortable with engaging in these kind of conversations when we're in the room in this sort of face-to-face environment. but doing this in a virtual environment where everyone is in their own space and making sure folks stay connected and feel safe is something that we were talking about and thinking about how we could adapt the strategies that were shared to align with our new online reality. We also talked about connecting to students with a story about your name. And I've done a variation of that particular activity before, and students always are very interested in my name as I explain to them that all three of my names are Irish. So I stand there as this African-American man with my three Irish names, and then we get a chance to talk about how that happened and how I am from Texas and I'm a descendant of slaves. So that leads us into a conversation about my identity and what I know about my name. So those were just some of the things that we talked about in our group.
Thank you, Kevin. Dr. Emily Field, please. You have 3 minutes.
Jabbar, would you like me to sum up for my group, or?
Yes, please go ahead.
Wanted me to sum up for my group? Or?
Yes, please.
So we were just talking about some of the things that really stuck out to people were the exercise on hopes and fears and really surfacing people's hopes and fears. And then we talked about talking through some of those fears and seeing how I added that they are based very much on people's own racial subject position. People very much valued this new idea of conflict as not necessarily something negative, and the am I getting, I think I'm good here. The difference between conflict and violence. And we talked also about the idea of being grateful for being here in a university setting where we get to talk to different kinds of people and interact across various kinds of boundaries. We talked more about the issue of ground rules as well, and some of the complications that I brought up in the chat around how ground rules can actually stifle conversation if they're not done carefully, and we talked through that a little bit. And we were lucky to have Dr. Barnett in our group with us, so we were hogging her. If other people have questions or responses to her, we had all her time. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we'll go back to Louis, please. You wanna?
Sure,
Yeah.
I'll do my best. So people were very happy to know that we can have these difficult conversations, that there is opportunities to integrate models and ways to navigate the difficulty that stems from these topics. Another good point that was made was in relationship to becoming self-aware of positionality, but also social identities, and how representation or the lack of can also impact the way that students interact with the faculty member, right? It essentially becomes a reciprocal relationship once that trust is built as professors and even students begin revealing themselves in regards to social identities. Because it is important to recognize that people come from different backgrounds and socializations, and that needs to be acknowledged. That was essentially the premise of what our group discussed.
Thank you, Doctor. And let's go to Dr. Wankatu.
In our group, we have a combination of faculty and students and staff from different departments. So we share our views and approaches to teaching race in our classrooms. And we, like the other groups, we also appreciated the ideas of hopes and fears, violence and conflicts, and all that, working through the groups and having students to work with each other. And so some faculty are talking about how they apply these ideas in the teaching of art, social work, psychology, and other topics in the curriculum. So they all think that really relate to what they teach, and even in topics that are not connected to race explicitly. the same kind of approaches could be applied to teaching difficult topics, including the sciences. So I think these are really good tips and tools for teaching race, and just to build the trust and collaborations among the students, along with the the goals of discussing these kinds of projects together. So we also think that it has to be consistent. It cannot be just like a one-off. It should be applied throughout the semester as well. So the community members also participated in the conversation. They also talk about that it's very appreciative about, BSU is doing that. The students also feel that it's very helpful.
Thank you, Doc. So this, I don't know if you see, do you see the title of the book?
Yeah.
Dean Barnett, if you have any other things to share with our great audience, and then for your good news, we have until now 56. So other people, they want, because they have classes, and we appreciate the fact that a lot of our students also participate. So Dr. Barnett, do you have anything? Are you unmute yourself, please? Yes.
Last thing I would say is that this was a presentation on teaching race, but somebody mentioned that some of these methods could be helpful in other contexts. I think it's absolutely true. Like, how do you I think about one of the best good doctors I know who teaches stats, and one of the things he does is he models some vulnerability. He tells students that he actually flunked stats the first time, right? People find it hard. He models this. He tells, how he kind of learned how to study. So he does a kind of good doctor that enables students to stick with him when they're scared in the stats class. So I do think that these things are useful for teaching all kinds of topics. I was also saying in the chat that I was in, or the breakout room, that a lot of these principles, I think, apply in other contexts. I know that as an academic leader, I think that they apply. And I was saying that, we recently had a very difficult conversation about the need to diversify our faculty. We have a very diverse student body. We are a primarily white faculty. And, so there's real work to be done to how do we write the ad, and how do we set the criteria, and how do we make sure that we don't fall into these implicit biases where we choose people whose education or backgrounds look a lot like our own, right? These things that we fall into. Anyway, we started to have the conversation among chairs, and I think it would have gone so much better if I had built some trust in the group. Like, you shouldn't assume that people are ready to have these conversations. There was conflict about like how hard it is or is not to hire a more diverse faculty. I come down strongly that is work that we can do, that there are things that we do wrong in the hiring, recruiting, and retention process that make people want to leave. So anyway, I'd like to say that I think that these are principles that can be useful in a variety of contexts for us, both in the university and I'm going to say as citizens.
Thank you. Let me ask Dr. Christina, Kristen, if you would like to share your question with our speaker, please.
So I was just sort of commenting in the chat that a lot of the tools that you've provided with us are so helpful in difficult topics in the sciences, but that so many difficult topics in the sciences are also the result or heavily impacted by significant racial injustice. And so so many of the tools you're providing are helpful in that context. And then I agree with you in terms of, how it is that we can now work together to come up with strategies around diversifying the faculty. This is very useful in my work as Dean of the College of Science and Mathematics. And so what I'm looking forward to this year, as we're all sort of focusing on planning for diversification of the faculty in the college, right? Because right now we can't hire, but this is a really unique opportunity to plan, right? And so how do we actually take a pause on the actual process of hire and then revamp that process of hire? So it's a really interesting. I'm finding this extremely useful.
That's so good.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I just want to present, I say this all the time, I don't know if it's helpful, but I say that if you're serious about diversifying your faculty, you are recruiting all of the time. You are getting to know people, you're going to conferences, you're paying attention to, you know, who's in the pipeline, you're creating your own pipeline, right? Like that you're really thinking about how you're going to move students to graduate school. So it's not something that starts with the search.
Right. You know, I assure you, Bridgewater State University is really up to the task, and we are attacking now. We are attacking intellectually, educationally. We are attacking the issues, not the persons with the issues. And so we're going to dismantle that. And I think we'll get there. This is a lot of work. It needs to be sustained, but sustainability starts with us, with our commitment to our students, to our staff, to our faculty, to our librarians, to our community at large. And so thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. At this point, I would like to bring Dr. Wenkaito, the Assistant Provost for Global Minnock Institute for Global Engagement, to give us his closing remarks.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Albaidi. I think you thanked a lot of people in the beginning, but I also wanted to thank you for inviting Dr. Barnett to speak for us and doing this workshop for the faculty and students. It's really our pleasure having her here, and thank you for us doing this workshop for us. I think, as Dr. Shanahan said in the beginning, we're in the beginning of organizing our campus efforts to address the issues of racial justice through teaching and learning and other campus efforts as well. I think this talk is one of the first programs that we connected to this effort and continue throughout the year to talk about how we do as a society, as a campus, as a society, and as a country in dealing with the challenges of racial inequities and racial justice. So as Dr. Grant and Dr. Shanahan and other faculty members like Dr. Field and Dr. McGowan, they are all involved in this effort. So as the Assistant Provost for Global Engagement, we look at this as a global phenomenon as well. It doesn't just happen in our country. There are a lot of racial injustices all over the world, and including our power relationship between countries that colonize different groups, and also power relationships between the majority and the ethnic minorities as well. What you have given us today is a lot of new ideas about how to apply these ideas practically in our classrooms. I really like your ideas about striking a balance between the cognitive understanding of racism and the kind of affective learning of racism, because we need to have knowledge on the one hand and empathy on the other. You cannot have one without the other. If you focus too much on just teaching the facts and the knowledge of it without understanding the emotive and emotional aspects of people's experiences, you're not going to drive home the ideas. On the other hand, if you only teach about empathy and affection and without any empirical grounding of the topic, students are not able to really think about how to address these topics in a broader context. I also like your discussion of trust and collaborative relationships in the classrooms. I do think that these ideas are critical for very successful faculty or teacher to connect to her students or his students. Finally, your ideas about, we have to address conflict, we have to address inequities, honesty, and with all our, all our resources. And we cannot go away from these kinds of difficult discussions because people are dying, people are hurting, and people are also suffering due to the inequities in society, whether it's racially based or other factors. So again, as we are all embroiled in the conflict of racial injustice in many parts of the country, whether it's the criminal justice system or the educational system or historical factors and economic reasons. We have to think about how we can do better as a country, as a university, as a society. So hopefully we will continue these kinds of discussions in the months to come. And again, on behalf of Bridgewater State University, thank you for talking to us. Really learn a lot, and please keep in touch with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr.
You're welcome.
Wankato. On behalf of the Minnock Institute for Global Engagement, the Office of Institutional Diversity, and the young but very aggressive positively, the African American Studies Program, thank you so much for your support. And I know without the support of our faculty, our librarians, our staff, and especially our students, and also I have to really say thank you and big thank you to our president and his commitment, President Fred Clark, to this cause, and also to our provost, Dr. Karim Ismaili. This is a collective call, and I hope we keep in touch. And, you know, first start with what I'm going to do today if I'm going to teach class in 15 minutes or 20 minutes. This is really the question. And how we're going to induce change in a way that start with ourselves. I mean, I'm so obsessed with this idea, and I read it in the book. You start with yourself, criticize yourself, break the ice with yourself, then you'll be able to break the ice with others. Thank you so much, very much, Dr. and Dean Pamela Barnett. Of course, I'm gonna bring you down to our beautiful campus. Thank you for this very, very important, very enlightening and insightful presentation. And thank you for my teams, my colleagues. I'm just pleased, and I'm humble, and I'm just delighted that we made this happen, and despite the pandemic and despite the power outages this morning in a lot of spaces in Massachusetts. Thank you so much. Stay safe, wear mask, keep the social distancing just in terms of the health, and keep in touch, and go vote. Please go vote. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you for the invitation.